No, there's been a tremendous change. I think we were in a period of optimism. Uh, we thought that we were reversing a set of policies of Reagan and Bush that had set the country in the wrong direction. We had a lot of debates inside the administration. Some of us worried a lot about inequality, but there were others who were focused on globalization and liberalization. And I think in the end, the groups that were focused more on globalization and liberalization won. And I think that many of the problems of today were created by some of the decisions that were made then. So that the financial market liberalization that occurred, some of the tax law changes, one of the things that happened that I fought very strongly against was lowering the tax rates on capital gains to the very rich. That has led to more inequality. So in a way, some of the seeds of our present problems were sown 25 years ago. The reason the Trump policies are particularly bad right now is that all the problems that we have, he's making them worse. So America has the highest level of inequality of any of the advanced countries and the lowest level of opportunity. And yet the tax cut in December 2017 resulted in raising the taxes in the middle class and lowering the taxes on billionaires and the corporations. One of the real problems in America is lack of access to health care. Life expectancy in the United States has been in decline since Trump became the president. And yet, his policies have resulted in millions and millions of more having no health insurance. Government is absolutely essential. It's part of what, in my book, I call a social contract between the market, the state, civil society. They all have to be there. To think about the regulatory role of the government, just imagine what our cities would be like if we had no stoplights. We would be in gridlock. Nobody could move. If we didn't have environmental regulations, our cities would be so polluted we couldn't breathe. They would be like London was before they passed environmental laws, like Beijing and New Delhi are today. But the role of government is more than regulation. One of the things I explain in my book is that the reason we have such a higher standard of living than we did 250 years ago is because of research. And the basis of all advances has been basic research, and government is at the center of providing for basic research. So there are a whole set of public expenditures, social protection, infrastructure, education, in which the government plays an absolutely central role. Piketty has performed a very important role in gathering data that highlights exactly how unequal we've become. And in some ways, he probably underestimates the degree of inequality, how much wealth goes to the top 1%. The challenge is what to do about it. And I've argued we need a more comprehensive approach than just taxing the wealth at the top. That's important. But it's also important to change the rules of the game, to curb monopoly power, to give workers more power, to curb the abuses of corporate governance that we see. And to have monetary policy that focuses on jobs, on employment, not just on inflation. So there's a broader agenda in the reforms in the economy, what I call in my book progressive capitalism. Other people call it 21st century social democracy. But whatever you call it, it goes well beyond the agenda of redistribution. It affects both the economy and politics. An economy's most important resource are its people. And if large segments of the population are not able to live up to their potential, then you're wasting your most important resource. Discrimination has the consequence of those who are in the wrong ethnic group or the wrong racial group not being able to live up to their potential, and therefore really interferes with the efficient potential of the economy. It obviously also has severe political consequences and moral consequences. Nativism is the idea that countries look to their own native populations. It's a version of nationalism, but it's a version of nationalism that says not only should we look inside the United States, but also only to certain groups within the United States. Of course, if America was really nativist, it would be American Indians. And all of your white people are immigrants that came to America from Europe. So there's a sort of a foolishness, a hypocrisy in people like Trump saying we're against immigrants. It would be like I'm against myself. But unfortunately, I think what's happened in many countries is that as economic conditions for those in the middle particularly have worsened, there are demagogues like Trump who blame others for mistakes in our own policy and say it's foreigners who took advantage of us in unfair trade agreements or immigrants that are the cause of our problems. It's absolutely wrong. If the United States hadn't had immigration, we would be where we were 500 years ago. Immigration has been of enormous benefit to the United States. If you start thinking of Silicon Valley, a very large fraction of the firms are started by immigrants, and a very large fraction of the rest were started by people who were first generation, children of immigrants. So you think of Apple and Steve Jobs, but you think of all the others who were actually started by people who were actually immigrants. Nativists are the ones who've turned against the view that we have to look all around the world. The progressives have argued we have to manage globalization in the right way. That if we don't manage globalization, there will be a lot of people who will suffer. The neoliberal view was a rising tide lifts all boats, that trickle-down economics. Globalization would increase the size of the national economic pie, and everybody would benefit. We know that theory is wrong. We have to manage globalization, because if we don't manage globalization, there will be people who will lose. And we have not managed globalization well over the last 40 years. And the result of that is there are a lot of people who have not done very well. We could have invested in these people, invested in these regions. The country as a whole is better off by globalization, but those gains have gone mostly to the people at the top. And so that's why I call for a restructuring of globalization to make sure that the benefits of globalization are more widely shared. Globalization has worked for the benefits mostly of the corporate interest and against workers in both the developed and developing countries. There are some developing countries, emerging markets, that manage globalization quite well. China is the most obvious example, where in the course of the last 35 years, it's moved some 750 million people out of poverty and increased its per capita income 10, 12-fold. So they managed it very well. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, globalization was very unfair to them. These are mostly agrarian economies, and the West, in writing the rules of globalization, maintained their protection on their goods, but told them you have to take away all of your protection on industrial goods. The result of this was that there has been a deindustrialization in Africa, and there was a quarter century of stagnation in Africa, where globalization, while it was helping those in East Asia and China, it was not working well for the poorest in the poorest countries. I think what is true is that the financial markets have often put their interest above the interest of society as a whole. And the worst manifestation of that was the global recession of 2008, which was caused by the financial sector. It wasn't just that they engaged in reckless risk-taking. They were engaged in a whole variety of, can only be described as predatory behavior, morally reprehensible. They took advantage of the most vulnerable citizens in our society. They engaged in market manipulation, abusive credit card practices, monopolization. You name it, they did it. So it is very understandable that President Hollande would make such a strong statement. On the other hand, no economy can function without a strong financial sector. So you need finance, but finance has not been serving the rest of society. So you have to manage the financial sector, and that means very strong regulation. We actually have to make the financial sector serve the rest of society. It's not just enough to prevent them from harming us. We actually have to make them do what they're supposed to do, provide money to help enterprises create jobs. One of the problems of the financial sector is its excessive influence, especially in the United States, in our politics. At one time, it was calculated that there were like 5 lobbyists for every congressman or a congresswoman. They couldn't even go to the bathroom without being chased by a lobbyist. Well, obviously, with so many lobbyists, it shapes economic policy. And the important lesson, I think, for all countries is there has to be a curbing of the power of money in politics. One of the solutions is for public support of campaigns. That's a positive part. The negative is not allow the excesses of expenditure. The last election, each of the candidates spent over $1 billion. And that money doesn't come out of the thin air. That comes by people making contributions, and when they make contributions, the contributions disproportionately, especially in the Republican Party, come from rich donors. And they don't view these as donations. They don't view these as social contributions. They view these as investments from which they expect returns. And unfortunately, they have gotten those returns. I think democracy is everywhere right now is in danger. It's especially in danger in the United States because we have a president who doesn't understand the basic principles of democratic governance. He doesn't understand separation of powers, the role of checks and balances, the role of a professional bureaucracy, all the things that we've learned in 200 years of development of democracy. He's trying to undermine all of it. One of the most disturbing aspects of what has happened in the last several years is that a questioning and maybe a realization of the flaws in our democracy. When I was young, we were taught we had the greatest democracy in the world. We even thought we had invented democracy. We forgot about the Greeks, but we thought we had really succeeded. These brilliant people in 1789 had created the most perfect constitution. 75% of Americans supporting an increase in the minimum wage, health care for all, curbs on gun controls, a whole list of better financial regulation. We can't get it through Congress. Why? Well, a vast majority of people are voting for Democratic candidates, but the Republicans have controlled the presidency twice in this century. Both of the Republican presidents of this century became president without a majority of the vote. I think we absolutely have to reform our electoral processes. Well, we need drastic changes in our economy and our society if we are going to meet the challenges of climate change. I think that will only happen through public action, through government action, through government regulation, and government investment. We need investment to infrastructure. We need a green infrastructure. We have to restructure our cities. It is a major task, and it won't happen on its own. And that's why, in the United States, people use the word Green New Deal, probably underestimates the magnitude of the challenge. It's really more like a wartime mobilization that we need. It is a war to preserve our planet. And yet it's a war where too many people don't see that right now we're losing. And Trump doesn't even think it exists. And so, in a sense, this is one of the dangers that Trump represents for the whole world.